Hi everyone! Welcome to the first part of this new permaculture series. This is going to be a 4-part series and it's going to give you an introduction to permaculture. So today I'm going to be starting with just kind of very basic introduction about what it is, where it sort of came from, some of the key thoughts and principles that influence permaculture as we have today. And then the following weeks are going to kind of pick up on some of the principles and talk about some practical ideas and some kind of creative ideas that you can use permaculture, whether it's in your garden, at home, it might be in your house, it might be in your work, or if you're running a project or a business. The idea with permaculture is that you can technically apply it to anything. And there's lots of different ways of describing permaculture. You might have heard it being described as a design tool. It's also a way of thinking. Some people might describe it more as a belief system or a philosophy. But technically, when you kind of look at it and break it down into kind of fundamentals, the way kind of I think about it is that it's very much a framework which you can use and apply to different situations and scenarios to help you solve problems. And it's very much focused on solutions and coming up with practical applications to overcome an issue or a problem or a situation. And it's really useful for lots of different things. So quite kind of commonly you might have seen permaculture in relation to agriculture or growing, community gardening, growing at home, small scale farming and things. And that's kind of very much how it started. But since then, it's sort of grown into a toolkit of ideas and this sort of very systems approach way of using it to design things in a way where you also think kind of ethically and morally about people and communities and also the planet and the earth and the resources in which we have. So it's very much trying to think about how we can design systems that are abundant and creative and joyful, whilst also acknowledging that within this world in which we live, there are limits, there are consequences to our actions, and we have to be mindful of that for future generations. So going back to the term permaculture and where it came from, so the phrase permaculture is made from kind of linking the word permanent and agriculture. And this was kind of coined by Bill Mollison and David Holmgren in the 70s over in Australia. And their kind of approach at the time was very much looking at agriculture. And they kind of saw, like many others, that sort of conventional, industrialized, modern agriculture was very detrimental to the planet. It was done in a way that wasn't fair to many communities, lots of people being kind of exploited. And the kind of advancements made at that time were reliant on lots of machinery, lots of sort of artificial and synthesized chemical inputs. And they kind of saw that, like many others, that this was not going to be sustainable into the future. It wasn't producing good quality food, and the land and many people on the land were suffering as a consequence of this. So they did a lot of research and a lot of observing and looking at different contexts of people, and sort of came up with this set of ethics and principles, and the idea that these could be implemented in any space, in any kind of context. They could be kind of researched and implemented to create a solution or a design that would be relevant for that place. So one kind of key thing about permaculture is that it's very much context driven, And there is no idea or there is no concept of one size fits all. It very much relates to who you are, who you're working with, where you're working, what the climate is, what the limits are, those kind of things. And this sort of holistic approach to looking at all of that together and observing that then allows you to come up with a solution that works for that space. And two people could be working in exactly the same space, they could have exactly the same restrictions and limitations, and they could design two very different systems, both which would have their own merit. So that's sort of a little bit kind of how it was kind of coined in the 70s. But permaculture has been around for much longer, and kind of the practices of permaculture, particularly within agriculture, you will see in all cultures all over the world, in a lot of traditional farming, small-scale farming communities, indigenous farmers, kind of using a lot of these principles just that have been passed down through their ancestors. And again, another kind of governing thought within permaculture is working with nature as opposed to working against it. And that's something that you see a lot in those communities. They understand the seasons, they understand the soil, the insects, the critters, the cycles of the moon, all of these things. And kind of that, working against nature can be a lot more effort, is kind of, there's a lot of resistance in that, whereas actually working with nature and still manipulating nature to a certain extent, it's not all total harmony, and we as people are part of nature, we're not separate from that, we're all in the same ecosystem, is really fundamental to creating systems that will last into the future. And kind of an example of permaculture not being anything new. So some of you, if you're gardeners or growers, you might have heard of biochar, which is something that's added into compost as an additive, and is kind of, in short, a really quick or a simple way of getting more carbon back into the soil. And this is kind of seen as kind of like a sort of fairly sort of new thing in sort of growing, small scale growing, home growing. Whereas when you look at the Amazon, kind of thousands of years ago, this was a practice that communities were doing there. They were burning pots and bones and old ceramics and things, and creating these really dark black soils, which are known as terra preta, in the soil. And that was kind of one way of increasing the fertility of the Amazon, which is sort of where they were obviously growing and relying on that land to provide for them. So there's lots of examples of permaculture being in practice for years and years and years, and many of the kind of permaculture practitioners that we have today have all learned and observed and shared or borrowed this knowledge from other people who have created it over thousands and thousands of years. So to go back to kind of the ethics, the three ethics are earth care, people care, and fair shares. And they seem kind of fairly self-explanatory, around kind of social justice, environmental justice, and this idea of fair shares, and this idea that we live within limits and there are limited resources, and trying to be mindful that these are more fairly shared across the world, as opposed to a lot of people having so much more than they need, others barely having enough to survive. So alongside those ethics are a set of principles, and I'll go more into detail on these things as we kind of go through the next few parts, but some of them are fairly straightforward things, like not making any waste, producing a yield, whether that be food or fibre, shelter and things, making use of renewable resources, so things like energy and using the sun, the wind and water, and then other things like creating systems that integrate functions as opposed to separating them out, and that kind of leads into some of the ideas around efficiency and redundancy and resilience. So that's just a really quick introduction of some of the kind of overall concepts, but the whole thing with permaculture is that we design working with nature, try not to work against nature too much. It's very kind of design focused, so there's a lot of observing and research and interacting, and the solutions that you come up with are kind of small scale and slow to a certain extent, and that means that they're very flexible, you can adapt them, they're very agile, and generally that kind of creates something that is more sustainable, and something that can then adapt slowly and be monitored long into the future. So that's all for this time, and next week I'll be going into detail in a few more of the principles.